Hello, I'm Peter Cole, and this is a supplement to the Japala conference that we had on September 22nd. I'm actually recording it about a week before our conference, so I'm going to go through in this supplemental video the history and some of the kind of the basics of Gestalt therapy so that you can get a little bit more detail than I was able to present at the conference. Um, my style for presenting is a little bit improvisational, so I don't think I'm going to cover this stuff in the workshop. But if there's some repetition from what we had at the workshop, I apologize. But I think we'll be getting into more detail and looking at things from a little bit different vantage point. Um, so let's just dive in. I'm basically going to be covering a lot of the material that's in the first chapter of our new book, New Directions in Gestalt Group Therapy, and by me, Peter Cole, and my wife, Daisy Reese, who you will meet at the conference, or you have met at the conference. Um, this is my first time of making a YouTube video, so I apologize for any lack of professionalism with it. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of history of Gestalt therapy. So Gestalt therapy was created basically by three founders. Um, Dr. Fritz Perls, who was an MD, Dr. Laura Perls, who was married to Fritz and was a psychologist, and they met in Germany in the pre-World War II period. They were Jewish, and they became refugees from the Nazis. They left Germany, and I'm not exactly sure what year it was, but must have been the late 30s. And they went first, I believe, to Holland. Then they were in South Africa during the war. They escaped. I believe that Fritz and Laura were the only survivors in their families. The others died in the Holocaust. Fritz served in the South African Army during World War II, and then after the war, he and Laura, who were very socially progressive, um, were not um, in sync, with the racial policies of South Africa, obviously. And when they could, they immigrated to New York, and pardon me, and that is where they lived for many years and created the first Gestalt Therapy Institute. Um, in 1951, um, Pearls, um, another theorist by the name of Ralph Hefferline, and a really important influence in Gestalt therapy, Dr. Paul Dr. Paul Goodman, um, joined forces, and in 51, they wrote the first and most intellectually challenging and amazing comprehensive book called Gestalt Therapy, Excitement and Growth in the Human Personality. So that was written by Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman. But Goodman was the main author of the theoretical half of the book. Pearls had written a manuscript, and then Goodman. Pearls had written the core of a manuscript, and then Goodman really made a masterpiece out of it. So Goodman, Paul Goodman, was If I were giving this talk in the 60s and 70s, everybody, you would have heard of him for sure. But he's not as well known now as he should be. But Paul Goodman was a man of letters. He was an intellectual. He taught at the University of Chicago. Um, he was bisexual and out. Um, Wrote about his sexuality in the 40s and the 50s. Was really an amazing, uh, way ahead of his time, revolutionary thinker. Um, he became very connected with the anti-war movement in the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War movement. Um, so Paul Goodman, Frederick Fritz Perls, and Laura Perls, they are really the founders of Gestalt therapy. Um, in the 60s, Fritz grew his hair long and became the kind of famous Fritz that people from the 60s and 70s know about, with the long hair and beard, and his writings about taking responsibility and existential freedom. He became very much a popular pop culture kind of a figure in the 60s and 70s. And he came out to the Esalen Institute, um, and which is on the coast just south of Carmel in California, and did many films and very popular demonstrations. Uh, and although Fritz popularized Gestalt therapy, uh, he did a little bit of a disservice to Gestalt as well, in that at this point there were many people who were involved in the practice of Gestalt therapy, because there was an institute in New York and an institute in Cleveland and in San Francisco, one's in LA, and he promoted a kind of a pop culture version of Gestalt therapy, which has been something of both a positive and a bit of an albatross for those of us who've been serious about Gestalt therapy over the years. Because Gestalt has always had a very serious-minded theoretical foundation to it. And the popular writings of Fritz at that time made it seem kind of much lighter weight, philosophically and intellectually, than it really was. At the same time that Fritz was out here in California, um, working at the Esalen Institute, his wife Laura was in New York and was continuing with the Gestalt Therapy Training Institute of New York, and training many therapists there and worldwide. So let me see. The next thing that I want to talk about are the various schools of Gestalt therapy which are relevant to group therapists. The first is what we call the relational school of Gestalt therapy, and the most influential people in that field are actually in LA with the Pacific Gestalt Institute. And they include Lynn Jacobs and Gary Yontif. And then up here in Northern California, another leader in that school of Gestalt therapy is Gordon Wheeler, who runs the Esalen Institute now. So there's the relational school, who tend to integrate intersubjective psychoanalytic thought with Gestalt therapy. Secondly, there is the work of Philip Lichtenberg, who was a social theorist at Bryn Mawr College. I happen to have had the good fortune to study with Dr. Lichtenberg at Bryn Mawr, and he was a great thinker, a great mentor. And his work around the political dimensions, social political dimensions of Gestalt are very relevant to our approach to group. Um, Thirdly, there were the Cleveland School of Gestalt therapists who integrated, did some early, actually a lot of early work in pretty much in the direction that Daisy and I have gone, which is integrating systems theory and group therapy theory with Gestalt therapy. Two more to go. Fourth is Dr. Irving Polster, who is also in Southern California. He's in La Jolla. And Irv actually did us the honor of writing the introduction to our book, which is a beautiful piece, by the way. Dr. Polster brings many dimensions to the work, but one of the things that is most influential for us, has influenced us greatly, is his approach to personal story, personal history. He wrote a beautiful book entitled Every Person's Life is Worth a Novel. And one of the ways in which we distinguish ourselves a little bit in the group therapy world is our very deep interest in each person's personal narrative and the intersecting of personal narratives that is our we were very influenced by Dr. Polster in our appreciation of that, of narrative and story. Story is not a bad word in our way of looking at group. Um, and finally, Dr. Bud Feeder. He was um, one of the original theorists who worked on taking Gestalt therapy out of its original modality, which had been, because this was Fritz Perls' orientation to group work, the method was called the open seat or the hot seat, and the way that group therapy was conducted was that an individual would do an intensive, what we call a piece of work with the leader in front of the group, and sometimes utilizing the group, but not in an interactive kind of Yalom sense. It's more really an interaction between the leader and the individual. His Dr. Feeder's books are Beyond the Hot Seat, Gestalt Approaches to Group, and Gestalt Group Therapy, A Practical Guide. Dr. Feeder has been another very important influence on us, and another person who's been a personal mentor to me, and somebody with whom I've collaborated very much over the years. I want to emphasize, and I'm sure that we will have talked about this in our day together next week, that we put a great deal of emphasis on the individual's growth in group. We the hot seat approach that Fritz did so beautifully is not something that we reject. It's rather something that we try to integrate. So, from Daisy and my perspective and our methodology, we will do a lot of interactive work and we'll do a lot of process work in the group, and we will also take a dive with individuals and go into an intensive piece of one-on-one work in front of the group with individuals. And then as that comes to a conclusion, and typically, by the way, an individual piece of work might last 15 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes. Um, so we'll kind of go into maybe a particular piece of work, whether it's around a historical piece or a particular aspect of how the group member is functioning that they want to work with, or with relationship, or really anything that we might deal with in psychotherapy could be a piece of work. And so we'll engage with the individual, and then as that wraps up, we'll come back into the flow of interactivity. And I think this is a little bit unique, although I know that all group therapists do some of this. But in Gestalt, we do this Gestalt group therapy. We do this very consciously, and it is really a part of our methodology. And we have ways of thinking about it, which we'll be covering on our day together. So I'm going to go over now some of the basics of Gestalt group therapy that I really didn't have time to get into in as much detail as I would have liked in our day together. So here are the topics that I'm going to cover, and these are just going basically through the first chapter of our book. The first one is field theory. The second is phenomenology. The third is the construction of our perceptions. The fourth is creative adjustments, fixed gestalts, awareness, figure formation and the cycle of experience, the cycle of experience and the significance of action, boundaries and boundary disturbances, and finally the contributions of Martin Buber um, in the arena that we call dialogue. So I don't know if I'll be able to cover all of this in incredible detail in the 38 minutes that I have left in our hour for this YouTube, but I'm gonna give it a shot. And obviously this is a little more detailed than we were able to present. Pardon me. By the way, this is a cup from UC Santa Cruz, where my daughter went to college. It's my little dad cup for that. Um, and all right, so yeah, we're not going to be able to go into incredible detail, but more than we could at the conference. I'll add a bibliography. Actually, what I'll do is I'll make a copy of this chapter, and I'll make that available for everybody here, which includes a bibliography at the end. Okay, so starting with field theory, the social psychologist Kurt Lewin developed the concept of field theory. Kurt Lewin, by the way, is considered by many to be one of the founders of group therapy. Kurt Lewin was not a Gestalt therapist, but he was a group therapist and a social theorist who was very influential in the creation of Gestalt therapy. So Lewin, by the way, who was another refugee from fascism. He was a Jewish sociologist, I think, or psychologist who came to the U.S. During the fascist times in Europe. Uh, Lewin was inspired by Einstein's physics, which revealed the unity of space, time, and gravity. And so um, he was interested in a holistic view. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the first paragraph of our talk about field theory. Just as the gravitation of planets can only be understood in relation to the space-time field in which those planets are embedded, people can only be understood in the context of the social world in which we are embedded. Each person lives within a life space, which is the world as perceived by a person who's relating to it. Um, so the field is our context. The field is the the broader um, arena in which we live, and it places each person in a social and environmental context. And it emphasizes the unity of the personal and the social. And this is very important in Gestalt therapy. Um, uh, we take an approach to people, I guess you would say, which is a, a unitary approach, meaning that we see the person in health, functioning in harmony with their community and with their environment. We don't ascribe to the old school. This is not modern psychoanalysis so much, but the original Freudian conception of the person being inhibited and constrained by the social ultimately, and that the id forces within the individual would cause chaos and harm, self-gratification that might be harmful to the other. In the field approach, we take the stance that if the individual thrives and meets their needs, then in a responsive environmental field, what their self-actualization will bring will be of a benefit to the society around them and to the people around them. So we make a distinction between self-social unity, which is the approach, the humanistic approach that we take in Gestalt therapy, with, on the other hand, self-social disparity, which would mean that the individual needs to repress themselves in order to, or suppress their destructive impulses in order to get along in society. Now, what this means for group is, if we think of the group as the broader field, or maybe the microcosmic field in which the individual is, the individual group member is participating, then the fulfillment of each individual in the group adds to the richness of the group as a whole. And for me, I find that a very facilitative kind of model because it allows me to not need to juxtapose or make into a polarity the group versus the individual. The group and the individual co-create each other. And as the individual comes into more of their creativity and finding their voice, this adds to the complexity of the group, and it adds to the capacity of the group to do more, to make more space for group members to continue to grow. Okay, that's just a little taste of field theory. Let me grab a little tea. That's the slug, by the way. That's the mascot of UC Santa Cruz. Okay, where were we? Okay, phenomenology. Okay, I'm just going to read you a little bit from the book, and then I'll talk more extemporaneously about this. Gestalt therapy is a tapestry made up of many theoretical threads, all of which emphasize the humanistic values of respect for the client's experience and a non-pathologizing, accepting approach to psychotherapy. Phenomenology, a concept that derives from the world of existential philosophy, is one of the threads that holds this tapestry together. Phenomenology is a method that supports the therapist in suspending judgments about the lived experience of the client and also of the therapist. The client's embodied conscious experience is deeply valued by the Gestalt therapist, and the therapist's judgments concerning the causality, veracity, or meaning of what the client is saying. We have a concept which is bracketing. We bracket or put aside our presuppositions about what the client's view is, what their feelings are, about what meaning they're making, and put our attention on being with the client in their phenomenology. So basically, my phenomenology is my experience, and my client's phenomenology is their experience in the here and now. And the phenomenological field, so we've got phenomenology, which is, what I experience, what you experience, what each group member experiences. And then there's the phenomenological field. The phenomenological field is the meeting place wherein in a dyad, therapist and client meet and connect, or in the group where many phenomenologies come together and create the incredible complexity that we experience in group. I'm going to read a little bit from our chapter here. This meeting of group members, each with their own phenomenology, lends a complexity and openness to Gestalt group therapy, which makes for a rich environment for therapist and group members. The therapist stays close to her own phenomenology, attending to her experiences of and her responses to the group. The therapist's basic method is to stay in awareness of her embodied experience of the group. As such, the therapist is open to all that occurs in the group and avoids interpreting the group's experiences according to any pre-existing template, preferring to be open to the meanings that emerge spontaneously from staying close to the therapist's own and the group member's phenomenal experience. So, a couple of things. What that means for us. meaning us being me and Daisy in our group work. For one thing, it means that uh, the map is not the territory. So whatever theoretical map I happen to be following, whether it's a Gestalt map or a cognitive behavioral map or a systems theory map, uh, a dialogical, DBT map, um, whatever map I happen, or psychoanalytic, of course, map, whatever map I am using to organize my theoretical um, understanding, that is distinct from my being with each group member's phenomenological experience. And also me being with the unique um, experience of the group as an environment, or the group as a whole, or the group as a living system. So we take theories of group roles to be very, very helpful. We're particularly interested in the work of R. Anthony Beck in that regard, which we write about in the book. Um, the roles such as scapegoat leader, emotional leader, defiant leader, we find that to be very helpful. And yet, um, that is not the territory, or the different phases of group forming, norming, storming, or the many, many different ways of thinking about the phases of group development. We learn those theories, um, and then we put them in the background when we're with the group, choosing to take the phenomenological stance, which is being with. Another dimension of the phenomenological approach, which I really find very respectful and I enjoy a lot, is that I enjoy a lot as a therapist and as a client, is that Gestalt therapists tend to be very light on interpretation. Um, Interpretation is not our main way of expressing ourselves, or expressing ourselves to the group or to our individual clients. Being in dialogue, connected, being emotionally attuned, that is the coin of the realm in the Gestalt approach. Not so much interpretation, although obviously interpretation happens sometimes, but we try to hold our interpretations lightly. Gestalt therapists are very fond of the word hunch. Uh, in other words, I have a hunch that what you're talking about might have this kind of meaning. But we like the word I have a hunch rather than saying this is what's happening, because we respect the phenomenological. It's a hard word to get out sometimes. The phenomenological experience of the client. They've got the last word on what their dream means, on what their emotions mean, what their reactions mean. Okay. What else to say about phenomenology? I think, to me, phenomenology is essentially about respect, and it's also respecting the client, and also it's about kind of lowering the power differential between the therapist and the group, the therapist and the client. because our interpretation is not the final word. It brings us into a more egalitarian kind of relationship than a more of a top-down orientation where I have the interpretation, I know what's happening, and I have that sort of power of knowledge. We take a more egalitarian approach. Um, we meet as equals in many, many ways, the therapist and the group. The therapist obviously has a different set of boundaries and responsibilities, and certainly has a great deal of power in the group. We don't question that, and we take responsibility for that in Gestalt. And yet, at the same time, on another level, we meet as equals. Um, we meet as co-creators of the experience, and we don't assume that the group leader is the person with the greatest wisdom in the group. Not by any means, and certainly not at all times. Okay, moving on to the construction of our perceptions. I'm just going to read a little bit to get us started here. Gestalt therapy takes a constructivist approach to human perception. Its view is that health is related to our capacity for constructing orderly, meaningful perceptions of the field. Further, since self is fully embedded in the field, the perceptions we construct always include ourselves and point us toward empowered action. So, this has a great deal of meaning for us, and it points us to some really important aspects of group work. Basically, what we're saying here is that each group member is actively constructing meaning and is actively perceiving all that occurs in the group. Now, where that takes us is very much connected with what the concepts of phenomenology bring to us. And that is an appreciation that each person is developing their own unique experience ongoingly of the group and all events that occur in the group. There is no master narrative, meaning I, the therapist, don't get to say with authority, this is what went down, this is what happened. You know, when person A had a conflict with person B in the group, and there were hurt feelings all around, and there may have been a rupture that occurred, emotional ruptures. Nobody gets the final word on what went down. We all have our own active constructing of what we have perceived. And what group is all about in many ways is bringing together each different person's construction of what has happened, their narrative of what is happening and what has happened. You may find, if you think about it, that in your groups, there are events that um, feel, seminal, and critically important to some group members um, that may barely pass the threshold of consciousness for others, such as a person talking about a particular issue or a particular conflict that occurred, or something good that happened, or a difficulty. Um, uh, each person has their own narrative in the group, and it's the meeting of those different perspectives that is so critical. The human meaning that we make, not the truth of the situation. Um, because we all have our own perception of what has happened in the social arena, and our goal is to be in dialogue about that, rather than to have one person's particular narrative become the final word or the master narrative. There is no master narrative. Okay. Next basic concept is a bunch of a bunch of basic concepts rolled into one uh, uh, little mini lecture here. Creative adjustments, fixed gestalts, fixed relational gestalts, awareness, and contact. Okay, now we could spend days literally on each of these concepts, but I'm going to try to cover them in 5 minutes. All of them. We'll see how I do. All right, so Pearls, Hefferline, and Goodman state that psychology is the study of creative adjustments. Okay, so what is a creative adjustment? A creative adjustment is how our adaptation to circumstances. So, for example, uh, um, if you are working with a person who had, for example, an intrusive father, let's say, who a demanding, intrusive father. That person in childhood may have made a creative adjustment, an adaptation to that father by becoming, say, timid and withdrawn. And withheld, but resentful. I mean, this is just one. I mean, we're all psychotherapists and we all deal with this kind of thing every day. So this is obviously just one example of an infinitude of different ways that we can creatively adjust to our environment in the original situation. We also use the term creative adjustment to talk about how we do that in the present time also. We make our best creative adjustment to our circumstances. So we use that in a positive sense, and really the phrase is meant to be positive, because if I did have an intrusive, abusive kind of father, it may have been a very good creative adaptation for me as a child to withdraw and to not challenge him. But uh, if that then we carry that into adulthood and we bring a kind of global timidity and inability to confront, then that may become problematic. So in Gestalt terminology, we talk about that original creative adaptation which has gotten sort of stuck in time and is now um, not the most adaptive way, but it's our way of coping. We call that our fixed gestalts, or it is a fixed gestalt. It would be a fixed gestalt that I am timid now because I was bullied and abused as a child. Um, so much of our work in Gestalt therapy is to um, help bring the fixed gestalts into awareness. So awareness is our next term, which is a pretty close cousin to the Buddhist and very, currently a lot of psychotherapies are exploring the issue of the methodology, the approach of mindfulness. So awareness is not exactly synonymous with mindfulness, but it's definitely um, in the same ballpark for sure. So awareness is getting in touch in a new way with something that has been fixed and set in our lives, our fixed gestalts. Fixed relational gestalts are ways in which our fixed gestalts show up in our relational themes or our relational connections. Um, so, for example, if we have somebody in the group who experienced a great deal of abandonment, for example, in in childhood and felt separate and apart from others, then they very well might bring that fixed relational gestalt into the group work, and we find that they become withdrawn and disconnected in the group. So that's a fixed relational gestalt. And other theorists, Dr. Lynn Jacobs in LA, has written about enduring relational themes. So it can be thought of as a kind of repeating kind of thematic pattern that, 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 that people bring to their relationships. And what better place to work with that than in group? Because these patterns can and will show up, and when they do, they provide a great opportunity for group process and for people to work on their fixed relational gestalts. Okay, finally, I want to discuss the concept of contact. One of the really revolutionary and awesome things that Paul Goodman and Fritz Perls came up with back in 1951 in uh, in in the original Gestalt therapy text, Excitement and Growth in the Human Personality, was the concept of uh, the starting place for human psychology not being the inner psyche so much. Both Freud and Jung um, had a kind of meta psychology in which uh, the metaphors had to do with uh, going inside. Um, and the Gestaltists brought a very challenging and different approach to the psyche, which was what happens. What we need to study in psychology and in psychotherapy is the connecting point, the relational connecting point between client and therapist, or between group members and other group members and leaders. So we're looking at psychology as occurring in the between. And the term contact is a way of thinking about the quality of connecting uh, that happens in the here and now with two embodied people, or in the case of a group, 8 or 10 or whatever number of people coming together into connection. So contact is a really critical concept because it goes right to the core of what Gestalt therapy is, which is about uh, the connection between an I and a thou, between me and you. And good quality contact is what we are all about. Being in a good flow with each other, being spontaneous with each other, being real with each other, being empathetic. These are some of the qualities that we bring, spontaneity, to good quality contact. Being in contact is both our method and, in a way, our goal, in the sense that we're hoping to help people make better quality contact in their world, in their relationships, with themselves, with each other. Okay, we've got about 7 minutes, so looks like I'm going to fail at getting to all the topics that I said I was going to cover. Which I guess is no surprise, since I said I was going to cover a lot. Let me briefly go over a few few more concepts. To talk about the paradoxical theory of change. So, the paradoxical theory of change is one of the most beautiful things about Gestalt therapy. I just love this, and I'm really glad to share it with you, and that I haven't run myself out of time before we got to this part. I'm just going to read you the little bit from our book about it. We close this chapter with the paradoxical theory of change, a simple but powerful idea that can be stated thus. Real, lasting change can best occur when we deeply and fully accept what is. Self-acceptance and a realistic assessment of the current situation are the cornerstones of the paradoxical theory of change. Self-acceptance means that I attend to my current positions and feelings without judging myself, even when I dislike or approve of my own feelings. So, one thing that I love about the paradoxical theory of change is its simplicity. There's a great Gestalt teacher who is in LA, by the way, Dr. Bob Resnick, who sometimes makes the humorous statement that when you're in Chicago, the only place you can call from is Chicago. And what Bob means by that is if I'm in a particular state of body, mind, and spirit, that's the only place I can make contact from. If I'm grieving, and which, by the way, I am. Peter, am a little sad today because I got word last night that a very, very long-term client of mine passed away after a long battle with cancer. I'm very sad about that. So when I'm in my grief, the only way that I can connect with you is by being where I am. Or if I'm in my anger, or if I'm in my excitement, if I'm in my joy, that's where we meet. So I find this to be a very beautiful and very empowering concept, in that it points to the need for self-acceptance. I am in the state that I am in, and facing the circumstances that I'm facing, and coming into awareness of that brings me into contact with myself. And then when I can relate with you, with the other, or with the group, from the state that I'm actually in, then I can make really true, authentic contact. The concept of the paradoxical theory of change was developed by Dr. Arnold Beiser, who was another guy. I believe I know he's from Southern California. I'm not exactly sure where. And another LA person, Liv Estrip, um, made a beautiful film um, about um, about his life, Arnie Beiser's life, called Flying Without Wings. And it tells the story of Beiser, who was a tennis champ in his youth and also, I believe, a surgeon. Um, and he contracted polio and became paralyzed and lived in an iron lung for many, many years. And he retrained in psychiatry. And miraculously, he was able to keep on living even in the iron lung and to have an amazingly productive life as a quadriplegic. He connected with Fritz Perls, who helped him um, adapt to his circumstances and to find existential freedom even when he was incredibly limited. Um, he developed the concept of the paradoxical theory of change to help himself deal with his extreme limitations to live a good and full life. And that is very inspiring to me. And I think a beautiful example of what we can achieve through engagement and self-acceptance. Okay, we are getting to the end of the hour. I'm sorry I wasn't able to go through everything that I wanted to cover, but I hope that this has been a good supplemental to your learning. And although you will be seeing this after we've met, I'm recording it before we've met, and so I'm looking forward to being with the Japala community, and some folks I think from the Gestalt community are coming as well to this conference. Okay, thank you very much. I'm signing out from Berkeley, California. Be in touch with me if you've got any questions or thoughts. PeterHayesCole@gmail.com. PeterHaysCole@gmail. Thanks.